Hello and welcome to another edition of Humble Theology. My name is John, and in these episodes we are looking at the Westminster Confession of Faith. We are currently reviewing the chapter on God's Providence, chapter 5, and we are currently looking in section 3 of Providence. And that section reads thus: God, in his ordinary providence, makes use of means, yet is free to work without, above, and against them at his pleasure. So as we're talking about providence, and we've looked at this in some of the other episodes, so feel free to go back and watch those, like and subscribe as you do that. But in God's providence, how does he control things? How is the world functioning, and what is his interaction with it? Well, in this part of the confession, it really kind of open-ends the question into what is God doing? How does he work or control or move within mankind according to his providence? We say by his providence that he's in control of everything. So how does that work? How does that play out? In section 2, we talked about means as in his being the first cause of all things, and yet using what's called second causes to allow things to happen, and yet he knows for certain that they will. So in section 3 now, we're talking about more or less those first causes of things we see in the world, and how is God functioning in and around these things. So that's real theoretical kind of stuff, but let's look back at the way this is worded in the confession and the scripture examples. We're going to look specifically at the scripture examples and discuss them a little bit. So it says, in his ordinary providence, he makes use of means. Well, so that means that he makes use of things, of means. One of the examples given in the catechism, in the confession rather, as means is when Paul is on a journey. It references Acts 27:31, and Paul on this journey, there's a huge storm and it starts to destroy the ship, and they're about to crash into the rocks and the ship is breaking apart, and the commander, the centurion says, well, everyone onto like the pieces of the ship. Unless you stay in the ship, you can't be saved. Well, that's using the means of a ship for salvation, and eventually it does start to crack and break apart, and it says people grabbed on parts of the ship that were broken, some of the planks and whatnot, and used those to make it to shore. There's use of means, using stuff. The crops in their season, sun, shine, rain, all that stuff for crops to grow. The ordinary means, the ordinary grace of how the world works to produce stuff. Okay, so that's one way. The next, it says that God is also free to work without means. So things that we normally wouldn't expect to happen, like Peter walking on the water, you wouldn't normally expect that to happen. Excuse me. God delivers people. Sometimes in Old Testament stories, they're the deliverance of the plagues. God supersedes the normal course of nature for there to be, all these different plagues that come about, different battles. Let's think of the Battle of Jericho. Well, they walk around the place 7 times in one day, each day prior to that one time a day. And so on this 7th day, going around it 7 times, they're blowing these trumpets, making a loud shout, and the walls just fall down. It's like, well, we could logically try to figure out, well, what seismic activity was going on that they caused, and all that kind of stuff. Or we just say, hey, it's a miracle. God worked without normal means. There wasn't a means there to be seen, so God intentionally brought it to pass on his own. Next, the confession says above means. And by above means, he speaks or uses, or the confession uses, the example of our salvation. When we say that we're saved, when we say that we believe, where did that belief come from? How did we gain this level of faith and belief? Well, it was the gift of God. mankind in our sin and our depravity. The scripture talks about sinners as being, blind, deaf, dead in our trespasses, sins. So if we're so against God and his word, why would it all of a sudden have this change and impact upon us to where we go, well, hey, all of a sudden now I believe it. All of a sudden it makes sense. That's God working against or above our condition to say, hey, I'm going to give them this gift of faith and salvation. I'm going to bless them above the normal means of what they have functionally within themselves. Because as fallen beings, we wouldn't attain to salvation. We wouldn't make a choice for God and his word. And then it says against them. So against different means. So things that you would expect to happen in nature just normally, the rules of physics and all those kinds of things. It says God can work against or counter to them. And again, the confession gives us two solid examples. One from 2 Kings 6:6. Elisha is working with his disciples, and as they're trying to clear an area, one is chopping wood. And in doing so, either the axe head flies off or the handle has broken. And either way, the iron axe head has fallen into the water. And he's like, oh, this was borrowed. And, I was supposed to give this back. He makes it known to Elisha. He says, well, where did it fall into the water? Well, about over here. And so Elijah, it says, throws in a stick, and the axe head ends up floating to the surface. There's no physical way to describe that. There's no logic or physics there that can say, oh, all of a sudden iron floated to the top. He's working against the normal means of gravity and the properties of water and iron. Another example, again, very solid, Daniel in the lion's den. Not the lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. That story. So they're thrown into the fire, and what do we expect fire to normally do as well? To burn and consume things. Plus they'd made this oven, this cauldron, whatever it was, super hot. I mean, it should have incinerated them as it did the guards who were throwing them in the first place. But it says they walked out without even their clothes being singed. It said their garments didn't even smell of smoke. So here the properties of fire, smoke, and normal clothing and the human condition of skin and so, these two things God worked above, or rather against, the normal means that we would expect to see in the world. And he did this and does all these things, the confession says, at his pleasure. So as the world is under God's control, well, yeah, we can look at the normalcy of the world and how we've interpreted it to work according to mathematics, physics, and all these other kinds of things. And to a large degree, God allows the world to work in such a fashion. But yet, we can't discount that he may work miraculously. He may work above those means. He may work against those means to bring about his purposes. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching, and join us and we'll continue talking about God's providence again next time. Bye-bye.